Hi. And so we come to the end of our lesson material and our chapter reading, and we're going to deal with both chapter 15 and 16 in this lesson. Chapter 15, oddly enough, they're very different. Chapter 15 talks about the ecosystem and how the energy flows through the ecosystem, through animals, through the environment, how the ecosystem is affected by a variety of different processes. And this is a place where we can look at a lot of the things that we're hearing about, a lot of the weather issues, a lot of the erosion issues of the glaciers, our abnormal heat maybe, or cold in different regions now. And it's very interesting. Again, we have to think about our worldview, and are we courtroom where we have a plaintiff, where we have a defendant, all of the evidence is the same evidence. It's the facts, the evidence. And yet those two, the plaintiff and the defendant, have different points of view, different worldviews that they are looking at the evidence or the facts, and a different perspective on what those facts mean. And so in this particular chapter in 15, as we talk about the ecosystem, the videos that I set up for you for tutorials actually are talking about the ecosystem in Australia, because we become very familiar with the news and the weather reports that we get from our hemisphere. So I thought that maybe a different perspective from a different hemisphere and what's transpiring in that hemisphere and how they are looking at the destruction of the environment or the change in the weather or the different kinds of ecosystems that they have are either grow or diminish according to the environment in a different hemisphere. So that's why I set up the tutorials for the Australian hemisphere. One of the things that I like to look at, and I know this is a topic that can be a controversial topic, but the whole idea of global warming and why our weather patterns have changed so drastically, and why our protective systems, why we don't have the kinds of protective systems in our environment that we have had in the past. Why are those happening? And is it in fact related to world population and the footprint of our population? Let me give you another perspective. In the Pacific Ocean, along the Asian continent, down through the Philippines and toward Australia, there are mountain ranges underneath the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. And those mountain ranges are called the Ring of Fire. And as they erupt, they're volcanoes, and as those volcanoes erupt, it changes a great deal that goes on under the ocean in the Pacific Ocean, which relates to also changing the amount of carbon dioxide that is put into the air through the evaporation that takes place in water bodies. We talked about this a couple chapters ago when we talked about carbon dioxide being let out into the environment through a variety of different things, decomposition of organic material, just the oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. And also we talked a little bit or your chapter talked a little bit about the carbon dioxide that comes from water bodies as the evaporation, as water is evaporated out of water bodies back into the atmosphere. Well, in the Pacific, in the Ring of Fire area, there is a great deal of volcanic activity that takes place under the Pacific Ocean. And you may have heard the phrase El Nino or El Nino, and those are two phrases that are directly related to this volcanic activity that takes place in the Pacific Ocean. And as a result, it affects the water temperature, the air temperature, the water evaporation in that Pacific South area. And with that air, that evaporation into the water changes the air, changes the amount of moisture in the air, and actually affects things like the droughts that are in California, and the heavy rains that might come through after the droughts in California. So this is all an ecosystem change. And it is reported over and over and over again as our weather change, our global warming is all, and then the severe cold. The Northeast right now has some tremendous snowstorms predicted for the next week or so. They've already gotten snow last weekend. It's unusual. It's not unusual for it to snow in October in the Northeast, but it is unusual to have this amount of snow, particularly that's happening off of the Great Lakes in northern New York on all the way up to Maine. And they're having, Michigan is going to have some tremendous snow in the next week or so. This is unusual for October and November, the amount of snow. And all of this is put into the whole ball of wax of global warming, where the common presence is, well, it's population, it's the carbon dioxide that people put into the air. You might have heard about the cow farting laws in Australia that has to do with flatulence, a cow flatulating and producing carbon dioxide, which cows don't flatulate. Cows have 3 stomachs, and so they regurgitate. They actually burp rather than flatulate. And there are a lot of things that we're told in our news presentations that are one perspective of what's going on. But as I said, I'm giving you another opportunity to think and observe and research this other perspective about the Ring of Fire, the volcanoes in the Pacific Ocean, how much more carbon dioxide is actually being released into the air, much, much more as those volcanoes are erupting under the water, the heat causing increased oxygen, carbon dioxide, particularly to come from the evaporation in the water. So that's just an example of the two different looks or two different perspectives on what's going on with our ecosystem. Then in chapter 19 talks about dying, and it talks about how our cells are programmed to die, how mutated cells die off so that they don't have such adverse effect on what the normal cellular activity is. And then it goes into aging and dying, which our bodies basically are programmed to do. And at the same time, in the scientific world, the evolutionist world, and our modern society, we have a number of scientists who are looking at trying to increase age. They look back even into the Bible and say, oh, well, the people in the Bible lived to be hundreds of years old. But they're not taking into consideration the impact of our environment on our bodies, our aging, how our cells are actually programmed to age. And so they're trying to stop aging. They're trying to reverse aging. There's a whole group of people with a very common thinking about how to, people are living longer. We have better medicine. We know more about our nutrition. We know more about exercise, how that actually allows for our body to sustain itself longer. And so there's many sciences that are trying to pinpoint areas where they can stop or reverse aging. So chapter 16 is about that. And so, like I said, those two chapters are not very long, and that's why we put them together so that you would have extra time to work on your research paper. And they're very diverse in their thinking, the two different subjects, but both interesting subjects because they can both relate to very common things that we hear today in our news, on our weather, arguments that people have about our environment, about what kind of impact we're having on our environment, sustainable energy, why we need sustainable energy, again, an impact on our environment, related to the impact on our environment. And so these last two chapters are going to be a wrap-up with a little bit of a different emphasis on the, not the same emphasis as the design of life being intellectual and coded by a creator in the cellular perspective, but the environment around us, and still how God's plan is a perfect plan and his design is a perfect plan, and how again we're having these two different views looking at the same evidence, and there are other thinking that you can investigate about the creationist view to some of these things that are going on, just like there's the difference of the plaintiff and the defendant looking, lawyers looking at the evidence and trying to put their spin on the evidence to get their to make their case. And when we, as the creationist perspective, actually can can depend on the authority of God and what we know of what God has told us in his word and his authority and in creation, we do have a very different perspective oftentimes. If you have any questions, or you're trying to wrap up your assignments, you're trying to wrap up your paper, please, if you have assignments that are missing, get them in. Go ahead, put them in. I will grade them accordingly. It's much better to get a grade than to get a 0 for a missing assignment. If you're having particular problems with something, please contact me. Either call me or contact me through the email, and I'd be happy to help you.